Monsters Inc. A cornerstone of many childhoods such as my own. Who could forget the fun and wholesome antics of the lovable Mike and Sulley, their hilarious buddy dynamic, their undying loyalty to each other, and their relatable goal of making history by emotionally traumatizing innocent children for a living?
Oh, good idea. You know, that wasn't very funny.
Yeah, funny to think, isn't it, that one of the most beloved children's films of the 21st century is about two guys making the film's target demographic terrified for their lives. But with that said, Sully and Mike are characters that are near and dear to the hearts of so many people. So if they're able to achieve that in spite of those types of actions, that's the sign of a great story that forces its characters to confront their preconceived notions of right and wrong and ultimately make them better people. I think the most immediately obvious way the movie goes about tackling this can be seen from the movie's opening. Fear of the unknown can be a very strong feeling as a kid, and it's easy to let that feeling manifest itself as a monster in your closet or under your bed, just this unknowable, malevolent force that wants you dead for reasons even your own imagination can't put together. And the first minute or so of this movie sets the monsters up how you'd expect, showing a shadowy creature in the room of a sleeping child about to strike. The child sees what's standing in front of him and... And without you even realizing it, the movie has pretty much instantly made you forget the scary aspects of the monsters. Now they're basically just quirky, relatively harmless creatures who scare or try to scare kids, but are not necessarily evil or aggressive. In this case, they're just kind of a bit clueless.
Oh, they stink.
And in the reveal that this child and bedroom are just a lifeless simulation, and any moral implications, for the time being, are basically just put out of the audience's mind, partly due to the lack of any real harm done. And also just the sheer disorientation that this child is a robot and this room is just a set in a larger factory. At that point, the ethics of what's going on here is kind of the last thing you're thinking about. The movie's first act continues on from this opening scene, and we're introduced to Mike, Sully, and Monsters Incorporated. And now that the opening scene has sufficiently numbed the initial shock of monsters scaring kids, the audience is much more likely to go along with this world where that type of thing has just been normalized.
We power your car, we warm your home, we light your city.
It's also helped by the fact that this world needs children's screams to even function, and the fact that these supposedly scary monsters are basically just regular people. I mean, this 7-foot-tall, feral-looking beast is named James, for God's sake. It does make it initially slightly easier to swallow the pill of what these monsters get up to on a daily basis. They're not scaring kids for any malicious reasons, they're doing it because they have to. And because of how likable and well-adjusted these characters are, it's much easier for the audience to start thinking, well, maybe they're not so bad. They're not hurting anyone, they're really just doing their jobs to keep their civilization running.
Just trying to make sure there's enough scream to go around.
In fact, the movie does such a good job at this that you might not even realize that the characters seem to have zero misgivings about tormenting children for their own personal gain, simply just because.
That is how the world works.
Then you make it to the scare floor where we see the scarers in action.
We got scarers coming out.
And again, in theory, this is a pretty dark scenario, a bunch of monsters invading children's bedrooms in the middle of the night. But the movie goes to great lengths to make sure that you're not thinking about that at that particular moment. Instead, it's just portrayed as a fun scene because from the monster's point of view, it's just a normal day for them. And that mindset is passed on to the audience through elements like the upbeat jazz music, the constant busyness of the environment, the high energy from everyone involved.
Oh, I'm feeling good today, Mikey.
Just get me another door.
The door, yes, door.
Attaboy, another door coming right up.
And let's not forget the fact that all these monsters are so nonchalant about this pretty inhumane practice that they've made a competition out of it.
May the best monster win.
I plan to.
But the most subtle and arguably most effective trick that the filmmakers pull to make sure you're not thinking about this from the kid's perspective is that we're not allowed to see it from the kid's perspective. Have you ever noticed that despite these kids being, kind of an integral part of this process, we never actually see any of them during the sequence? And this works for the movie because it firmly plants you into the minds of these monsters and how they see these kids. In essence, they don't see them. They're not individuals deserving of respect or compassion as far as they're concerned, just resources to be pulled from. And just in case you did pick up on any of that, the movie has one more trick up its sleeve to make sure that you at least somewhat sympathize with the monsters.
20 2319! We have a 2319!
Up until this point, the movie has briefly mentioned here and there the supposed toxicity of human children to monsters. But it isn't until this scene where we see just how seriously the monsters take it. This has the effect of making the audience a little more sympathetic to what these monsters are doing. It's slightly harder to call these monsters aggressive bullies when, as far as they and we as viewers know, they are the ones who are apparently being put at risk in this scenario. But then the movie goes on, and Mike and Sully find themselves on an adventure that will challenge their worldviews that they spent their whole lives working in support of. Sully, upon investigating a door mysteriously left active after hours, accidentally lets a little girl into the monster world, putting the entire city into a panic and prompting the authorities to show up to decontaminate the area.
Well, I don't think that thing could have gone any worse.
Yeah, that's not the clip you remember seeing, is it? I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but I think more people should know about this. If you're not aware, the scene of Boo terrorizing the Harryhausen's restaurant was originally going to end with the Child Detection Agency blowing the place up to avoid contamination. It was changed because, without going into specifics, the movie came out in November of 2001, and recent events in the US had made that type of imagery kind of a delicate subject. So it was reanimated to look like this.
Well, I don't think that thing could have gone any worse.
Now, to approach this subject as sensitively as I can, I do think it was for the best that this scene got changed. Regardless of the joke you're trying to make, there's a time and place for it, and late 2001 was not that. With that said, though, looking back on this scene over 20 years later, taken in isolation from a tragic event that it just happened to coincide with, this original version is way funnier, purely for how excessive it is in response to a small child running loose. By contrast, the version we got is a little too vague and abstract in terms of what's actually going on to really be funny. But it was a change made at the very last minute. This was probably the best Pixar could do under the circumstances. Controversial issues aside, though, this is where the monster's existing relationship with human children starts to get deconstructed for the audience. For starters, we see just how little the monsters actually understand them, with witnesses telling obviously panic-induced misinterpretations of what they saw that night.
Well, a kid flew right over me and blasted a car with its laser vision.
Mike himself seems to have his own self-contradicting perception of Boo, alternating between seeing her as a conniving, sadistic killer and a wild animal.
That thing is a killing machine!
But now that Sully is forced to essentially take on a temporary parental role until they can send her home, he starts to see a child as an actual person for the first time. He notices that she doesn't seem comfortable being left on her own in a bedroom, and then we find out why.
Hey, that looks like Randall.
And here we have the first indication that even if the monsters aren't physically hurting the kids, scaring them isn't exactly harmless. The fact that Boo seems familiar with Randall implies that she's been scared by him somewhat regularly, to the point where she's afraid to even go to sleep. And this leads to Sully, opposed to what he would usually do to a kid lying in bed, stays and comforts her until she nods off. But he's still not exactly been disillusioned from his line of work, as evidenced by one particular attempt to calm her down.
I'm not gonna scare you. I'm off duty.
Notice how he doesn't leave it at, I'm not going to scare you, or even just, I don't want to scare you. His reasoning is literally just, I don't have a reason to scare you at this particular moment. The movie continues onward. Sully and Boo go through most of the runtime on increasingly good terms, with Sully realizing that Boo, and by extension other kids, aren't actually toxic. But then he gets roped into a scaring demonstration. He goes along with it, not really considering the implications of doing it in front of Boo, because again, this is just a normal part of his day and something the audience has come to expect. So, much like with Sully, it's a shocking moment of realization for the audience when we see Boo's reaction. And for the first time in Sully's career, he has to deal with the aftermath of a scare.
I was just... Oh, no, don't be scared.
He tries to justify it, telling her that it wasn't real and it's just a misunderstanding. And then he quite literally sees it from her perspective. And in an instant, his successful career that he's immensely proud of and has spent his entire life building up gets recontextualized. And it's a success story built on the emotional abuse of small, innocent children.
Did you see the way she looked at me?
This rift between Sully and Boo ultimately doesn't last very long, as he eventually saves her from Randall and Mr. Waternoose, who have been conspiring to kidnap children to exploit for even more energy than what is currently being produced by the Scarers.
I am about to revolutionize the scaring industry. Say hello to the Scream Extractor.
And it's through this that we see that disregard for the children's well-being that the scaring industry has and Sully used to have going completely unchecked. Their plan is to transition from scaring kids to permanently abducting them into a miserable existence because, as far as this society at its worst is concerned, the quality of life for those children really is that meaningless to them. Mr. Waternoose's plan gets exposed and he's arrested. But with that in mind, the monster world needs to get his energy from somewhere, and I don't think its best scarer can, in good conscience, keep business going as usual after everything he's learned. But then he has an idea.
At least we had some laughs, right?
Sully remembers that children's laughs seem to be an even more effective form of energy than Scream, and he takes over Monsters Incorporated with this in mind. I'll be honest, when I first started making this video, I wasn't sure how exactly I was going to approach this point. I considered calling it a little too convenient of a solution, like, oh, there just happens to be a more ethical way of getting energy from children, and it also just happens to be significantly more powerful.
Well, isn't that nice?
But upon reflection, I think it works. Consider this. The monster world got its energy from children's screams because someone figured out that they could do that. But there's so much baseless, irrational fear surrounding those children that nobody took the time to find a better way or even think that the kids were worth that compassion in the first place. And while Randall and Mr. Waternoose based their plan on taking that cruelty and lack of curiosity to its absolute extreme, Sully found a solution by instead taking the time to learn about one of them. He learned that human children are not a danger to monsters, and that the methods the monsters have been using to collect energy aren't even particularly efficient. So he took that to heart and found a new business strategy that benefits both the monsters and the children. To me, that's the central message of Monsters Inc. Be curious about the world around you, and above all, be nice to people. Not only is it just extending common courtesy to people you might not have even realized were obviously entitled to it, not only is it a way of making new emotional connections with people, but it can also foster positive change in the world around you in ways you never even thought were possible. And when you finally look back on all you've gone through with those new people and new things you've discovered, you realize you didn't have nothing until you had them.
Kitty.
Special shout out to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed and Zelda. Thank you so much for the support.